Tonight we begin with a mystery. Not a mystery hidden within the ruins of an ancient city. Not a forgotten kingdom swallowed by the sands of time. But a mystery preserved in something far simpler. A series of footprints. Thousands of years ago, somewhere in what is now the vast desert of New Mexico, a group of people walked across soft ground near the edge of an ancient lake. They left behind no written records. No monuments. No names. Only footprints. For countless generations, those footprints remained hidden beneath layers of earth and sediment. Wind blew across the landscape. Ice ages came and went. Entire species appeared and vanished. Civilizations rose and fell across the world. Yet somehow the footprints survived. Then, in the 21st century, archaeologists working in the White Sands region made an astonishing discovery. Beneath the desert surface lay evidence of human activity far older than many experts believed possible. At first, the finding seemed almost impossible. For decades, the traditional story of the first Americans appeared relatively straightforward. According to the accepted model, small groups of hunter-gatherers crossed a land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska near the end of the last ice age. These people gradually spread throughout North and South America, becoming the ancestors of indigenous peoples across the continents. The timeline seemed well established. The evidence appeared solid. The debate, many believed, had largely been settled. But the footprints at White Sands told a different story. According to the dating results, these ancient travelers may have walked across the landscape more than 20,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than the traditional timeline allowed. If the dates were correct, then something extraordinary had happened. Either our understanding of American prehistory was incomplete, or the first chapters of human history in the Americas were far older and far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Scientists around the world reacted with excitement, curiosity, and skepticism. Could the dating methods be wrong? Could natural processes have created misleading evidence? Or had researchers uncovered one of the most important archaeological discoveries of modern times? The questions did not stop there. If people were living in the Americas so much earlier than expected, how had they arrived? What routes had they taken? What challenges had they overcome? And perhaps most intriguingly of all, who exactly were they? Over the years, headlines and documentaries have sometimes suggested a dramatic possibility that the first Americans may have been completely different from the people who followed them. Some stories have even raised the question of whether they belonged to a different branch of humanity altogether. It is a fascinating idea. But as we will discover tonight, the truth is both more complicated and more interesting than the headlines suggest. As we journey through ancient footprints, forgotten migrations, ice age landscapes, mysterious fossils, and revolutionary DNA discoveries, we will explore one of the greatest puzzles in human history. The story of the first Americans. A story that continues to change with every new discovery. And a story whose ending remains unwritten. Before we can understand who the first Americans were, we must travel much further back in time. Far beyond the footprints preserved in the sands of New Mexico. Far beyond the oldest known villages, monuments, and civilizations. We must journey to a world that would seem almost unrecognizable today. A world shaped by ice. Around 20,000 years ago, Earth was locked within the grip of the last ice age. The climate was colder than it is now. Vast sheets of ice covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere. In some places, these glaciers stretched for thousands of miles, slowly creeping across the landscape over countless generations. North America looked very different from the continent we know today. Huge glaciers blanketed much of Canada and extended deep into what is now the northern United States. Walls of ice towered above the landscape, in some places reaching heights greater than modern skyscrapers. Entire regions disappeared beneath frozen expanses that reflected sunlight back into the atmosphere. The world felt larger, harsher, and far more challenging. Yet the Ice Age was not simply a frozen wasteland. Many areas remained surprisingly rich with life. Across vast grasslands known as mammoth steppes, enormous herds of animals wandered beneath open skies. Woolly mammoths traveled in family groups across the plains. Giant bison grazed on hardy vegetation. Massive ground sloths, some standing taller than modern elephants when they reared up on their hind legs, searched for food among scattered forests. Predators followed close behind. Fearsome saber-toothed cats stalked the shadows. Dire wolves hunted in coordinated packs. Giant short-faced bears roamed territories larger than some modern countries. It was a world of giants. A world where survival depended upon constant awareness and adaptability. The Ice Age also transformed the shape of the planet itself. Because so much water was trapped inside glaciers, Global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern boundaries. Areas that now lie beneath oceans were once dry land. Entire landscapes existed where waves roll today. One of the most important of these vanished lands connected northeastern Asia and northwestern North America. But we will return to that story later. For now, let us turn our attention to humanity. While mammoths crossed frozen plains and glaciers dominated northern continents, human beings were already spread across much of Africa, Europe, and Asia. These early people were remarkably adaptable. They possessed no modern machines, no metal tools, no written language. Yet they survived in environments ranging from scorching deserts to frozen tundra. Small groups of hunter-gatherers moved across the landscape in search of food, water, shelter, and opportunity. Their lives were closely connected to the rhythms of nature. They followed migrating animals. They gathered seasonal plants. They adapted to changing weather patterns. And perhaps most importantly, they explored. Human history is, in many ways, a story of movement. Generation after generation, people pushed beyond familiar horizons. Sometimes they followed herds into new territories. Sometimes they searched for better resources. Sometimes population growth encouraged groups to seek new lands. Most likely, they rarely thought of themselves as explorers. They were simply doing what humans had always done. Moving forward. One valley at a time. One river at a time. One generation at a time. Across Asia, small communities occupied vast regions stretching from the forests of Siberia to the grasslands of Central Asia. They developed specialized hunting techniques and learned how to survive some of the harshest environments on Earth. Without realizing it, these people were living near one of history's greatest frontiers. A frontier that separated two enormous worlds. On one side lay Asia, already inhabited by countless generations of humans. On the other side lay an entire continent, or perhaps multiple continents, filled with rivers, mountains, forests, deserts, and untapped resources. A land where no permanent human populations are known to have existed. At least, according to the traditional story. And this brings us to one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. Who were the first people to enter the Americas? When did they arrive? How did they make the journey? Did they walk across forgotten landscapes now hidden beneath the sea? Did they travel along ancient coastlines? Or did they arrive far earlier than scientists once believed possible? For much of the 20th century, researchers thought they had finally discovered the answer. The explanation seemed elegant, simple, and supported by convincing evidence. It became known as the traditional story of the first Americans. A story centered on an ancient land bridge, Ice Age hunters, and a remarkable migration that would eventually populate two vast continents. And it is to that story that we now turn. As we left our travelers standing at the edge of an unknown world, one question remained unanswered. How did the first humans reach the Americas? For much of the 20th century, scientists believed they had found the answer. The explanation seemed simple, logical, and supported by the best evidence available at the time. It all began with a place that no longer exists. A place known as Beringia. Today, a narrow stretch of water called the Bering Strait separates eastern Siberia from western Alaska. The distance is relatively small, only about 85 kilometers at its narrowest point. But during the height of the last ice age, the world looked very different. As enormous glaciers locked away vast quantities of Earth's water, sea levels dropped dramatically. Coastlines expanded, and regions that are now hidden beneath the ocean emerged as dry land. Between Asia and North America, a vast landmass appeared. This was Beringia. Far from being a simple land bridge, Beringia was an enormous region stretching hundreds of miles across. It contained rolling grasslands, rivers, lakes, and enough vegetation to support large populations of animals. Mammoths roamed its plains. Bison grazed across its open landscapes. Predators followed close behind. To the animals and people living there, Beringia would not have seemed like a bridge at all. It would have felt like another part of the world. A place where life could flourish despite the harsh climate. For archaeologists, Beringia offered a fascinating possibility. If humans had already reached northeastern Asia during the Ice Age, perhaps they could simply have walked into North America. No boats, no advanced technology. Just generations of movement across connected landscapes. The idea was elegant. And for decades, it appeared to fit the available evidence perfectly. The second piece of the puzzle emerged in the 1930s. Near the town of Clovis in New Mexico, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. They discovered carefully crafted stone spear points unlike any previously found. The points were beautifully shaped, sharp, and remarkably sophisticated. Their distinctive fluted design allowed them to be attached securely to hunting spears. These tools were clearly the work of skilled hunters. Even more importantly, some of the spear points were discovered alongside the remains of extinct Ice Age animals. This suggested that the people who made them had lived thousands of years ago. Researchers became fascinated. As excavations continued across North America, similar spear points began appearing at numerous locations. The pattern seemed unmistakable. A widespread culture had once existed across much of the continent. Archaeologists called these people the Clovis culture. And for many years, Clovis appeared to represent the earliest known inhabitants of the Americas. The theory that followed became known as Clovis-first. According to this model, the first Americans crossed Beringia from Siberia into Alaska near the end of the Ice Age. As the climate gradually warmed, enormous glaciers began retreating. This created an opening between major ice sheets in western Canada. Scientists referred to this route as the ice-free corridor. The theory proposed that Clovis hunters traveled south through this corridor approximately 13,000 years ago. Once they entered the continent, they spread rapidly across North America and eventually into South America. It was a compelling narrative. Simple. Understandable. Supported by archaeological evidence. As additional Clovis sites were discovered, confidence in the theory grew stronger. Many researchers considered the question essentially solved. The first Americans had been identified. Their route had been mapped. Their timeline had been established. For several generations, the Clovis-first model dominated academic thinking. It appeared in textbooks. It was taught in universities. Museum exhibits presented it as the accepted explanation for the peopling of the Americas. Students learned it as historical fact. Researchers built entire careers studying its details. The theory became one of archaeology's greatest success stories. Of course, science is always based on the evidence available at a particular moment. And during much of the 20th century, the evidence strongly favored Clovis-first. No older sites had been conclusively proven. No discovery seemed capable of overturning the dominant narrative. Everything appeared to fit together neatly. Humans crossed Beringia. They moved through the ice-free corridor. They became the Clovis culture. And from there they populated the continents. Mystery solved. Or so it seemed. Because history has a habit of surprising us. Far from laboratories and museums, archaeologists continued digging. At remote sites scattered across North and South America, they occasionally uncovered evidence that did not fit the accepted timeline. At first, these discoveries were often dismissed. Some appeared too old. Others seemed impossible. Many researchers assumed mistakes had been made. After all, the Clovis-first theory was supported by decades of evidence and scholarly consensus. But the strange discoveries kept appearing. Again and again. Each new site raised uncomfortable questions. What if humans had arrived earlier than 13,000 years ago? What if the ice-free corridor was not the first route into the Americas? What if the Clovis people were not the first Americans after all? Slowly, cracks began to appear in the once solid foundation of the traditional story. And those cracks would soon grow into one of the greatest debates in the history of archaeology. For decades, the Clovis-first theory stood as one of archaeology's most widely accepted explanations. The story appeared complete. Humans had crossed Beringia, traveled through an ice-free corridor, and entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago. The evidence seemed convincing. The timeline seemed secure. And yet, scattered across the continents, strange discoveries began to emerge. At first, they appeared to be little more than isolated curiosities. A few unusual artifacts. A handful of unexpected dates. Sites that did not seem to fit the established narrative. Most researchers assumed there must be an explanation. Perhaps the dating methods were inaccurate. Perhaps natural processes had disturbed the archaeological layers. Perhaps enthusiastic archaeologists had simply made mistakes. After all, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But as the years passed, the number of unusual discoveries continued to grow. And one of the most important appeared far from North America. It emerged near the southern tip of South America, in modern-day Chile. The site became known as Monte Verde. When archaeologist Tom Dillahay and his team began excavating there, they uncovered remarkable evidence of ancient human activity. Wooden structures, stone tools, animal remains, preserved plant materials, even traces of ancient campsites. What made the discovery truly astonishing was its age. The dating results suggested that people had been living at Monte Verde more than 14,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. This created a serious problem. If humans were already living deep in South America before the Clovis culture appeared in North America, then the traditional timeline could not be correct. The implications were enormous. To reach Chile, people would have needed time to travel thousands of miles across 2 continents. They could not suddenly appear at the southern end of the Americas without first passing through countless regions to the north. Yet many scientists remained unconvinced. The debate became intense. Supporters argued that the evidence was strong and carefully documented. Critics questioned the dating methods and interpretations. For years, Monte Verde became one of archaeology's most controversial sites. Eventually, however, the evidence proved difficult to ignore. As more experts examined the findings, acceptance gradually increased. Monte Verde was no longer viewed as an impossible claim. Instead, it became one of the strongest challenges to the Clovis-first model. But Monte Verde was only the beginning. Thousands of miles away, another puzzling site emerged in Pennsylvania. Known as Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, this location had provided shelter to humans for thousands of years. Protected beneath an overhanging rock formation, layers of ancient occupation accumulated over time. Archaeologists uncovered stone tools, hearths, and evidence of repeated human activity. Once again, the dates caused concern. Some samples appeared significantly older than the Clovis culture. If accurate, they suggested that humans occupied eastern North America much earlier than previously believed. Predictably, controversy followed. Some researchers questioned whether underground coal deposits might have contaminated the dating samples. Others remained skeptical of the site's extraordinary age. The discussions continued for decades. Yet Meadowcroft refused to disappear from the conversation. It remained one of several sites hinting that the traditional story might be incomplete. Then attention shifted northward. Far into the Yukon Territory of Canada. Near the border with Alaska lies a remote location known as Bluefish Caves. At first glance, the site appears unremarkable. A series of caves surrounded by rugged wilderness. But inside, researchers discovered animal bones bearing marks that some experts interpreted as evidence of human butchering. If these interpretations were correct, the implications were profound. Some of the bones appeared to date back more than 20,000 years. Such dates pushed human presence in North America far beyond the accepted Clovis timeline. Not surprisingly, disagreement followed. Were the marks truly created by human tools? Or could natural processes have produced similar patterns? The debate continued for many years. Even today, discussions surrounding Bluefish Caves remain active. Yet for many researchers, the site represented another intriguing piece of a growing puzzle. Then came Cooper's Ferry. Located in present-day Idaho, this site added another layer to the mystery. Archaeologists uncovered stone tools and evidence of human occupation dating to more than 15,000 years ago. Once again, the timeline appeared older than Clovis. The findings suggested that people may have been living in western North America long before the traditional migration model allowed. What made Cooper's Ferry especially interesting was its location. The site appeared consistent with the possibility of an early migration route following rivers and perhaps even ancient coastal pathways. The discovery encouraged researchers to think beyond the ice-free corridor. Perhaps the first Americans had entered the continent by routes that archaeologists had not fully considered. By now, a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Monte Verde, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, Bluefish Caves, Cooper's Ferry. Each site possessed its own strengths and weaknesses. Each remained the subject of debate. Yet together they raised a troubling question. What if Clovis was not first? For decades, archaeology had been built around a relatively straightforward narrative. Now evidence from multiple locations seemed to suggest a more complicated reality. Older dates. Unexpected settlements. Human activity appearing where it supposedly should not exist. Many scientists resisted these conclusions. Not because they feared new discoveries but because science demands caution. Extraordinary claims must survive careful scrutiny. Researchers challenged dating methods. They questioned interpretations. They searched for alternative explanations. Healthy skepticism became part of the process. And in many cases, that skepticism improved the quality of the evidence. Excavations became more rigorous. Dating techniques became more precise. Standards became higher. Slowly, site by site, the conversation began to change. What had once been dismissed as impossible gradually became plausible. What had once seemed radical became worthy of serious consideration. The Clovis-first theory was no longer unchallenged. Cracks were spreading through the old narrative. And somewhere beyond those cracks waited an even more astonishing discovery. A discovery that would preserve not tools, not bones, not campsites, but the actual footprints of ancient people themselves. Footprints that would soon force scientists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the first Americans. For decades, archaeologists debated sites like Monte Verde, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, Bluefish Caves, and Cooper's Ferry. Each discovery raised important questions. Each challenged the traditional timeline in its own way. Yet critics could often point to uncertainties. Perhaps the dating was incorrect. Perhaps the artifacts had been disturbed. Perhaps there was another explanation. Then came a discovery that was far more difficult to dismiss. Not ancient tools. Not animal bones. Not fragments of campsites. But something far more personal. Footprints. The story begins in the vast desert landscapes of southern New Mexico. Today the region is known as White Sands. At first glance, it appears almost otherworldly. Brilliant white dunes stretch toward the horizon. The landscape seems quiet and timeless. Wind sweeps across the desert, constantly reshaping the surface. Yet thousands of years ago this place looked completely different. During the Ice Age, much of the region was covered by ancient lakes, wetlands, and grasslands. Animals gathered near water sources, and human groups moved across the landscape in search of food and resources. The environment was alive with activity. And occasionally, as people walked across soft mud near the edges of these ancient lakes, they left footprints behind. Most footprints disappear quickly. Rain washes them away. Wind erases them. Time destroys them. But under rare conditions, footprints can become preserved. Layers of sediment gradually cover them. The impressions harden. And eventually they become part of the geological record itself. For thousands of years, the footprints at White Sands remained hidden beneath the earth. No one knew they existed. Then archaeologists made an astonishing discovery. Beneath the desert surface lay dozens of ancient trackways. Some stretched for great distances. Others crossed and overlapped. Together they formed a remarkable snapshot of a world long vanished. Researchers could clearly see the impressions of human feet. Adults. Teenagers. Children. Individuals walking alone. Groups moving together. For archaeologists, it was like opening a window into the distant past. Unlike stone tools or broken bones, footprints capture a moment. A single instant frozen in time. They reveal movement, direction, behavior, even emotion in some cases. The discovery was extraordinary. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Scientists needed to determine the age of the footprints. To do this, researchers carefully analyzed plant materials found within layers associated with the tracks. Using radiocarbon dating and other scientific techniques, they attempted to establish when these ancient people had crossed the landscape. The results stunned the archaeological community. The dates suggested the footprints were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. At first, many experts could hardly believe it. Such dates would place humans in North America during the height of the last glacial maximum. This was one of the coldest periods of the Ice Age. Massive glaciers dominated large portions of the continent. Traditional migration models assumed that human movement into the Americas occurred much later. Yet here was evidence suggesting that people were already present thousands of years earlier. If the dating proved correct, the implications were enormous. The Clovis culture could no longer represent the first Americans. Even many pre-Clovis sites would suddenly appear relatively recent. The timeline of American prehistory would need significant revision. The discovery quickly attracted worldwide attention. Newspapers reported the findings. Scientific journals published detailed analyses. Researchers from numerous disciplines began examining the evidence. Some called it one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the century. And it was easy to understand why. The footprints did not merely suggest human presence. They demonstrated it directly. Someone had stood there. Someone had walked there. Someone had left those impressions in the mud more than 20,000 years ago. The tracks also revealed fascinating details about daily life. Some pathways appeared to have been made by adults carrying children. Others showed groups moving together across the landscape. Several trackways suggested repeated journeys between locations. Researchers could almost imagine the scenes. A parent hurrying across a muddy shoreline. Children exploring near the water's edge. Families navigating the challenges of Ice Age life. For a brief moment, ancient people ceased to be abstract figures in textbooks. They became real individuals. Human beings living ordinary lives in an extraordinary world. Perhaps this is what makes footprints so powerful. Stone tools reveal technology. Bones reveal biology. But footprints reveal behavior. They capture movement itself. A direct connection between the present and the distant past. Yet despite the excitement, debate continued. Some researchers questioned the dating methods. Others wondered whether the plant materials used for dating accurately reflected the age of the footprints. Additional studies were conducted. New analyses were performed. Supporters argued that the evidence remained strong. Critics continued to call for caution. As often happens in science, the discussion became detailed and complex. But regardless of where individual researchers stood, one fact was undeniable. The White Sands footprints had transformed the conversation. Questions that once seemed settled were now open once again. The possibility of a much earlier human presence in North America could no longer be ignored. And this led directly to an even greater mystery. If humans truly occupied the Americas 21 to 23,000 years ago, how had they arrived? The traditional ice-free corridor may not yet have been available. The old migration timeline no longer seems sufficient. So what route had these ancient travelers taken? Did they move along forgotten coastlines? Did they travel by sea? Or was there another pathway into the Americas that modern researchers have yet to fully understand? The footprints had answered one question, but they had created many more. And the search for those answers would lead archaeologists toward entirely new theories about humanity's journey into the New World. The footprints of White Sands raised a difficult question. If people were already living in North America more than 20,000 years ago, how had they arrived? For decades, the traditional answer focused on the ice-free corridor. According to that model, ancient hunters crossed Beringia and moved south through an opening between massive glaciers in western Canada. But there was a problem. Some researchers began to suspect that the corridor may not have been fully accessible when the earliest people entered the Americas. If that was true, another route would be needed. And so archaeologists started looking toward the ocean. At first, the idea seemed unusual. When most people imagine Ice Age migrations, they picture travelers crossing frozen plains, following mammoths across open grasslands, and moving through rugged wilderness. Few imagine ancient people traveling along coastlines. Yet the Pacific coast may have offered something incredibly valuable. A natural highway. A route rich in food, water, and resources. This idea eventually became known as the Kelp Highway theory. The theory proposes that some of the first Americans traveled along the Pacific coastline rather than through the interior of the continent. Instead of waiting for glaciers to retreat, these groups may have followed coastal environments stretching from northeastern Asia all the way down the western edge of North America. To understand why this route attracted attention, we must first imagine the coastline of the Ice Age world. The Pacific shore was very different from what we see today. Sea levels were significantly lower. Large areas of land now hidden beneath the ocean were exposed. Coastal plains stretched outward for miles. Protected bays, islands, and rich marine ecosystems lined the shoreline. Most importantly, these environments provided food. An extraordinary amount of food. The name Kelp Highway comes from vast underwater forests of kelp that thrive along many Pacific coastlines. These marine ecosystems support an incredible variety of life. Fish swam among the kelp forests. Shellfish clung to rocky shores. Seabirds gathered in large numbers. Marine mammals such as seals and sea lions occupied coastal waters. For prehistoric hunter-gatherers, such environments would have been extremely attractive. Unlike inland hunting, which often depended on tracking large game animals over great distances, coastal living offered a more predictable supply of resources. Food could be gathered year-round. Fishing opportunities were abundant. Shellfish could often be collected with relatively simple tools. A group traveling along the coastline would not necessarily need to make long journeys between food sources. Instead, they could move gradually from one productive environment to another. Generation after generation. Year after year. Slowly expanding their range across thousands of miles. In this way, migration may not have felt like a grand expedition at all. It may simply have been a continuation of ordinary life. Families moving to new camps. Children growing up beside unfamiliar shores. Communities exploring the next bay, the next river, the next coastline. Eventually reaching lands no humans had previously occupied. The coastal route also offered another important advantage. It may have remained accessible during periods when inland pathways were blocked by glaciers. While massive ice sheets dominated parts of North America, certain coastal regions may have provided navigable corridors for human movement. Even small watercraft could have helped people cross short distances between islands and coastal refuges. Of course, proving such a migration is extremely difficult. And the reason lies beneath the ocean itself. At the end of the Ice Age, global temperatures began to rise. The glaciers slowly melted. As enormous quantities of water returned to the oceans, sea levels increased. Over thousands of years, ancient coastlines disappeared. Campgrounds vanished. Hunting sites were submerged. Entire landscapes slipped beneath the waves. If early migrants traveled along the Pacific coast, much of the evidence may now lie underwater. This presents one of archaeology's greatest challenges. Researchers are searching for traces of campsites, tools, and settlements that may be hidden beneath modern seas. Finding such evidence is expensive, technically difficult, and often impossible in many locations. Yet despite these obstacles, several discoveries have provided support for coastal migration theories. Archaeological sites along the Pacific coast have revealed evidence of ancient maritime adaptations. Researchers have found signs that prehistoric populations possessed the skills necessary to exploit marine environments. Some early sites appear older than would be expected under the traditional Clovis timeline. Others suggest that coastal regions may have played a more important role in human migration than previously believed. While no single discovery has conclusively proven the Kelp Highway theory, the idea has gained significant attention within the scientific community. For many researchers, it offers a plausible explanation for how humans could have reached the Americas earlier than expected. Especially if sites like White Sands accurately reflect a very ancient human presence. The theory is elegant. It explains early dates. It avoids some of the challenges associated with the ice-free corridor. And it fits well with humanity's remarkable ability to adapt to diverse environments. But not everyone agreed. Some archaeologists remained unconvinced. Others believed that different routes might have been used. And a few researchers proposed something even more controversial. A theory suggesting that some ancient travelers may not have come from Asia along the Pacific coast at all. Instead, they may have crossed an entirely different ocean, the Atlantic. As archaeologists searched for new explanations of how the first Americans reached the New World, most attention focused on routes connected to Asia. The Bering Land Bridge, the Pacific coastline, ancient coastal migrations. These ideas remained rooted in a basic assumption. The first Americans ultimately came from northeastern Asia. But not everyone agreed. A small group of researchers proposed a far more controversial possibility. What if some of the earliest people in North America had arrived from Europe instead? The idea sounded almost unbelievable. Yet it emerged from an observation that initially seemed intriguing. When archaeologists compared certain Clovis stone tools from North America with much older tools associated with the Solutrean culture of Ice Age Europe, they noticed what appeared to be similarities. The Solutrean people lived in parts of Western Europe roughly 20,000 years ago. They were skilled stone tool makers. Some of their spear points displayed remarkable craftsmanship and sophisticated shaping techniques. At first glance, certain Clovis points appeared somewhat similar. Both traditions produced carefully crafted stone weapons. Both demonstrated impressive levels of technical skill. To some researchers, the resemblance seemed more than coincidence. Could there be a connection? This question eventually gave rise to what became known as the Solutrean hypothesis. According to the theory, small groups of European hunters may have traveled westward across the North Atlantic during the Ice Age. Rather than crossing an open ocean in a single voyage, proponents suggested that travelers could have moved gradually along the edge of sea ice. They might have hunted marine mammals, gathered resources, and progressed from one region to another over many generations. Eventually, according to the hypothesis, some of these people could have reached North America. If true, the theory would dramatically reshape our understanding of the first Americans. It would suggest that at least some ancient populations entered the New World from Europe rather than Asia. Naturally, such a bold proposal attracted considerable attention. Supporters pointed to the apparent similarities between certain stone tools. They argued that some Clovis technologies looked unusually advanced. They suggested that the Atlantic Ice Age environment may have provided opportunities for long-distance movement. And because archaeology often uncovers surprising discoveries, they believed the idea deserved serious consideration. For a time, the Solutrean hypothesis generated widespread discussion. Documentaries explored the possibility. Books examined the evidence. Debates emerged within the archaeological community. Yet as researchers investigated the theory more closely, significant problems began to appear. The first and perhaps most important challenge came from genetics. Over the past few decades, advances in ancient DNA analysis have revolutionized the study of human history. Scientists can now examine genetic material from ancient remains and compare it with populations around the world. Again and again, these studies pointed toward Asian origins for the ancestors of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The genetic evidence consistently supported migrations from Siberia and neighboring regions. Researchers found little evidence suggesting a major contribution from Ice Age European populations associated with the Solutrean culture. If Europeans had played a significant role in the earliest peopling of the Americas, many scientists expected clearer genetic traces. Those traces did not appear. The second problem involved geography. The proposed Atlantic route was extraordinarily challenging. Even during the Ice Age, travelers would have faced vast distances, dangerous weather, freezing temperatures, and uncertain access to resources. While prehistoric humans were remarkably adaptable, many researchers questioned whether such a journey was realistic. The evidence supporting a transatlantic migration remained limited. In contrast, routes through Beringia and along the Pacific coast required far fewer assumptions. They aligned more closely with known human migrations and available archaeological data. Another issue involved the stone tools themselves. As more detailed analyses were conducted, many experts concluded that the similarities between Solutrean and Clovis technologies were not as compelling as they initially appeared. Humans in different regions sometimes develop similar solutions to similar problems. A resemblance between tools does not necessarily prove direct contact. What once seemed like strong evidence became less convincing under closer examination. For these reasons, the vast majority of archaeologists today do not accept the Solutrean hypothesis as the primary explanation for the peopling of the Americas. Most researchers continue to favor models involving Asian populations moving through Beringia and, possibly, along Pacific coastal routes. Yet despite its rejection by most experts, the Solutrean debate remains valuable. It demonstrates an important principle of science. Ideas should be examined. Evidence should be tested. Assumptions should be questioned. Even theories that ultimately prove incorrect can help researchers refine their methods and strengthen their understanding. The history of science is filled with hypotheses that inspired investigation, sparked debate, and encouraged new discoveries. The Solutrean hypothesis became one of those ideas, not because it solved the mystery, but because it forced archaeologists to think more carefully about the evidence. And while debates about migration routes continued, another revolution was quietly taking place. Researchers were beginning to look beyond stone tools and ancient campsites. They were turning their attention toward something even older, something hidden deep within human bones and DNA. A search that would lead them to humanity's ancient relatives, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and mysterious populations known only through genetic clues. The story of the first Americans was about to become even stranger. By now, we have encountered footprints older than expected, archaeological sites that challenged accepted timelines, and migration theories that sparked fierce debate. Yet perhaps the most intriguing question of all remains: were the first Americans actually different from us? Some headlines have gone even further. They have suggested that the earliest inhabitants of the Americas may have belonged to a completely different human species. It is a dramatic idea, the kind of claim that captures attention immediately. But to understand where such suggestions come from, we must first travel far beyond the Americas, back to a discovery made in Europe during the 19th century. In 1856, workers quarrying limestone in Germany's Neander Valley uncovered unusual human bones. At first, nobody fully understood their significance. The skull looked different. The brow ridges were heavier. The bones appeared unusually robust. Eventually, scientists realized they belonged to a previously unknown type of human. These ancient relatives became known as Neanderthals. For many years, Neanderthals were portrayed as primitive cave dwellers, slow, brutish, less intelligent than modern humans. Today, that image has largely disappeared. Research has revealed that Neanderthals were remarkably capable people. They made tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals, cared for injured members of their communities. Some evidence even suggests symbolic behavior and artistic expression. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals occupied large parts of Europe and Western Asia. Then, around 40,000 years ago, they disappeared. Or at least, that is what people once believed. Because modern genetics revealed something unexpected. Neanderthals never completely vanished. They survive within us. Most people with ancestry outside Africa carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA inherited from ancient encounters between modern humans and Neanderthal populations. At some point in the distant past, the two groups met, and they had children together. The story of humanity suddenly became much more complicated. But the surprises were only beginning. In 2008, researchers working in a remote cave in Siberia discovered a tiny fragment of bone. At first glance, it seemed insignificant. A small piece of a finger bone. Nothing more. Yet when scientists extracted DNA from the fossil, they made an astonishing discovery. The bone did not belong to a Neanderthal, nor did it belong to a modern human. Instead, it came from an entirely unknown human group. Researchers named them the Denisovans. The discovery shocked the scientific world. An entire branch of humanity had remained hidden until a tiny fragment of bone revealed its existence. Over time, additional evidence emerged. Denisovans appear to have occupied parts of Asia for thousands of years. Like Neanderthals, they were close relatives of modern humans. And like Neanderthals, they interbred with our ancestors. Today, traces of Denisovan DNA survive in several modern populations, particularly among people whose ancestors lived in parts of Asia and Oceania. Once again, the human family tree became more complex. It was no longer a simple story of one species replacing another. Instead, ancient human groups met, interacted, and sometimes mixed. Human history resembled a braided river rather than a straight line. And this realization led scientists toward an even stranger possibility. What if there were other human populations we have not yet discovered? Researchers began finding genetic patterns that did not fit known groups. Certain pieces of DNA seemed to come from populations for which no fossils had ever been found. Scientists referred to these mysterious ancestors as ghost populations, not because they were supernatural, but because their existence could only be detected through genetic clues, like shadows lingering within the genome. The idea was extraordinary. Entire groups of ancient humans may have lived and disappeared without leaving recognizable skeletal remains. Yet traces of them still survive within our DNA. Naturally, discoveries like these inspired speculation about the first Americans. Could ancient populations entering the Americas have carried genetic ancestry that was different from later groups? Could they have inherited DNA from Neanderthals, Denisovans, or even unknown ghost populations? The answer in a limited sense is yes. Like many ancient peoples, the ancestors of Native Americans almost certainly carried some Neanderthal ancestry. Certain populations connected to Asia also carried Denisovan ancestry. These genetic connections reflect ancient interactions that occurred long before people entered the Americas. However, this is where sensational headlines often create confusion. When people hear phrases such as different human species or unknown human ancestors, it is easy to imagine something dramatic. Perhaps a lost race of humans living in the Americas. Perhaps a completely separate species unlike ourselves. Perhaps forgotten civilizations descended from mysterious beings. But this is not what most scientists mean. The evidence does not suggest that the first Americans were a separate species unrelated to modern humans. Everything we currently know indicates that they were Homo sapiens, members of our own species. They laughed, worked, raised children, faced dangers, made decisions, and experienced the same fundamental human emotions that people experience today. What makes them fascinating is not that they were alien to us. It is that they were connected to a much larger and more diverse human story than we once imagined. Their ancestors may have interacted with Neanderthals. They may have inherited Denisovan DNA. They may even carry traces of genetic lineages we have yet to fully understand. In that sense, the first Americans were part of a world populated by multiple kinds of humans. A world far more complex than the simple narratives taught only a few generations ago. And as researchers continued searching for answers, they turned once again to physical evidence. Not footprints, not genes, but bones, ancient skeletons, unusual skulls, remains whose appearance seemed to challenge expectations and raise entirely new questions about the earliest people of the Americas. Questions that would soon ignite one of the most controversial debates in American archaeology. As researchers explored ancient DNA and humanity's complex ancestry, another discovery emerged that would ignite one of the most heated debates in American archaeology. The controversy began in the summer of 1996. Along the banks of the Columbia River in Washington state, two spectators attending a boat race noticed something unusual protruding from the shoreline. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary bone. But when experts examined the remains, they realized they had discovered an almost complete ancient human skeleton. The individual would become known as Kennewick Man. From the very beginning, the discovery attracted enormous attention. The skeleton was exceptionally well preserved. Scientists immediately recognized its potential importance. Radiocarbon dating eventually revealed that the individual had lived approximately 9,000 years ago. This made the remains among the oldest and most complete ancient human skeletons ever discovered in North America. Yet it was not the age alone that sparked controversy. It was the appearance of the skull. Some researchers observed that certain facial and cranial features appeared different from what they expected to see in an ancient Native American individual. The skull did not fit neatly into existing assumptions. As a result, speculation quickly spread. Various theories emerged. Some suggested connections to populations from Asia. Others proposed links to ancient groups from Europe or the Pacific. Media coverage often amplified the uncertainty. Headlines sometimes implied that Kennewick Man represented a mysterious people unrelated to Native Americans. The debate became increasingly intense. Scientists wanted to study the remains in greater detail. They hoped that further research might reveal valuable information about the earliest inhabitants of the Americas. At the same time, many Native American communities viewed the remains differently. Several indigenous tribes of the region believed the individual was one of their ancestors and argued that the skeleton should be treated with respect and reburied according to traditional customs. These perspectives reflected different ways of understanding the past. For scientists, the skeleton represented a unique opportunity for research. For indigenous communities, it represented a human being whose remains deserved dignity and proper care. The disagreement soon moved beyond archaeology. Legal battles followed. Court cases lasted for years. Questions about ancestry, cultural affiliation, scientific access, and indigenous rights became central to the dispute. The controversy attracted national attention and became one of the most significant archaeological legal cases in American history. For a long time, no clear resolution seemed possible. Then technology changed the conversation. Advances in ancient DNA analysis allowed researchers to examine genetic material preserved within the skeleton. For the first time, scientists could look beyond skull shape and physical appearance. They could directly investigate ancestry. The results proved revealing. The genetic evidence showed that Kennewick Man was closely related to modern Native American populations. Despite the unusual features of the skull, the DNA pointed clearly toward indigenous ancestry. Many of the earlier assumptions based solely on physical appearance proved misleading. The findings helped resolve much of the debate. They also provided an important lesson. Human populations can display tremendous physical diversity. Appearances do not always reveal ancestry accurately. People living thousands of years ago may have looked different from modern populations while still sharing deep genetic connections. In many ways, Kennewick Man transformed archaeology's understanding of ancient human variation. The discovery reminded researchers that the past is often more complicated than simple categories suggest. And it demonstrated the growing power of genetic science. For generations, archaeologists relied primarily on bones, artifacts, and physical measurements. Now DNA was offering entirely new ways to answer old questions. As more ancient genomes were analyzed, a clearer picture of the first Americans began to emerge. The mysteries were far from solved. But genetics was starting to reveal details that previous generations of researchers could only imagine. And those discoveries would soon revolutionize our understanding of how the Americas were first populated. For most of the history of archaeology, researchers relied on what they could see: stone tools, ancient campsites, bones and skulls. These discoveries revealed important clues, but they also left many questions unanswered. Where had ancient people come from? How were different populations related? And what journeys had their ancestors taken across the world? Then a scientific revolution began. It arrived not through excavation alone, but through the study of something hidden inside every living thing: DNA. For decades, recovering genetic material from ancient remains seemed almost impossible. Time destroys DNA. Heat, moisture, and bacteria gradually break it down. Most ancient skeletons contain only tiny fragments of genetic information. Yet advances in technology transformed what scientists could accomplish. Researchers developed methods capable of extracting and analyzing DNA from remains thousands, and sometimes tens of thousands, of years old. Suddenly, the past could speak in an entirely new way. Scientists no longer needed to rely solely on the shape of skulls or the style of stone tools. They could examine genetic relationships directly. Ancient DNA technology quickly began reshaping our understanding of the first Americans. Researchers sequenced genomes from ancient human remains across Asia and the Americas. As the evidence accumulated, a remarkable pattern emerged. Again and again, genetic studies pointed toward northeastern Asia. The ancestors of indigenous peoples in the Americas shared deep genetic connections with ancient populations living in Siberia and nearby regions. This supported the idea that the first Americans ultimately originated from Asian populations. But the story proved more complex than a simple migration from one continent to another. Genetic evidence suggested that some ancestral populations spent long periods isolated in a region associated with ancient Beringia. Rather than immediately crossing into the Americas, these groups may have lived for thousands of years in or near the Beringian region. Scientists sometimes refer to these people as Beringian ancestors. Over time, portions of these populations expanded into the Americas, carrying their genetic heritage with them. The DNA evidence also challenged older assumptions about a single migration event. For many years, people imagined one group entering the New World and spreading across the continents. Modern genetics revealed a more complicated picture. Researchers found evidence suggesting multiple migration waves and population movements over thousands of years. Different groups entered at different times. Some populations expanded rapidly. Others remained isolated. Still others mixed with neighboring communities. The result was a rich and dynamic history rather than a single journey. Genetics also revealed evidence of population bottlenecks. A bottleneck occurs when a relatively small group gives rise to a much larger population. Because only a limited number of individuals contribute genetic material, certain patterns become visible within the DNA of later generations. Many indigenous populations in the Americas appear to share signs of such ancient bottlenecks. These clues help researchers estimate population sizes, migration timing, and relationships among ancient groups. Perhaps most importantly, modern indigenous peoples have played a crucial role in understanding this history. Their genetic heritage preserves information passed down through countless generations. When studied respectfully and ethically, these genetic connections provide valuable insights into humanity's ancient journeys. Combined with archaeology, geology, and anthropology, DNA has helped create one of the clearest pictures yet of how the Americas were populated. The mysteries have not disappeared. Researchers continue to debate exact timelines, migration routes, and population relationships. But compared with previous generations, scientists now possess far more powerful tools. Ancient genomes have transformed speculation into evidence. The result is a story both more detailed and more fascinating than anyone once imagined. A story of migrations, isolation, adaptation, and survival across immense distances and challenging environments. And now that we have traced the journeys of these ancient peoples, we can turn our attention to another question. What kind of world awaited them when they arrived? Because the Americas they entered were unlike anything we see today. A land of giant animals, vast wilderness, and extraordinary opportunities. A true Ice Age world. Long before cities, roads, or civilizations existed, the Americas were home to a world unlike anything we know today. It was a land of giants. Vast grasslands stretched beyond the horizon. Dense forests covered valleys and mountains. Rivers flowed through untouched wilderness. And roaming across these landscapes were some of the most extraordinary animals that ever lived. Among the most famous were the mammoths. These enormous relatives of modern elephants wandered across much of North America during the Ice Age. Towering over humans, mammoths traveled in family groups and fed on grasses, shrubs, and other vegetation. Their long curved tusks could reach impressive lengths, and their thick fur protected them from the cold climate. For ancient people, mammoths represented both opportunity and danger. A successful hunt could provide enormous quantities of meat, hides for clothing and shelter, and bones that could be used as tools or building materials. Yet hunting such massive creatures required skill, cooperation, and courage. Mammoths were not the only giants sharing the landscape. Another remarkable animal was the giant ground sloth. Unlike the tree-dwelling sloths of today, these creatures could stand several meters tall when rising on their hind legs. Their powerful claws helped them pull down branches and defend themselves from predators. Slow-moving but formidable, they were among the most unusual animals ever to inhabit the Americas. Predators also prowled the Ice Age wilderness. Dire wolves hunted in packs across open plains and woodlands. Larger and more heavily built than many modern wolves, they were powerful hunters capable of bringing down large prey. Nearby, another fearsome predator ruled the continent. The American lion. Even larger than most modern lions, these magnificent cats stalked mammoths, horses, bison, and other animals across vast territories. For humans, sharing the landscape with such predators demanded constant awareness. Every journey carried risks. Every hunt required caution. Survival depended on knowledge, teamwork, and experience. Ancient hunters likely developed sophisticated strategies for obtaining food. Groups may have worked together to track animals across great distances. They learned seasonal migration patterns and understood the behavior of their prey. Natural features such as cliffs, valleys, and river crossings may have helped them gain advantages during hunts. Success was rarely guaranteed. Each expedition involved uncertainty. Yet these communities adapted remarkably well to their environment. Life was about more than hunting. Families formed the foundation of survival. Children learned essential skills by observing older generations. Knowledge passed from parents to children, from elders to young hunters. People shared food, tools, and responsibilities. Cooperation strengthened communities and increased their chances of enduring difficult conditions. Shelter was equally important. Depending on local environments, people may have used animal hides, wooden structures, brush shelters, or natural rock formations for protection. Campfires provided warmth during cold nights and served as gathering places where stories, knowledge, and traditions could be shared. Although much remains unknown, many researchers believe these early peoples possessed rich cultural and spiritual lives. Like humans throughout history, they likely sought meaning in the world around them. The stars overhead. The animals they hunted. The rivers, mountains, and landscapes they depended upon. Artifacts discovered at ancient sites suggest that symbolic thinking and cultural traditions played important roles in daily life. Yet survival was never easy. Weather could change suddenly. Food supplies could become scarce. Injuries, illness, and dangerous predators posed constant threats. Ice Age America was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Every day required resilience. Every season brought new challenges. And still, these communities endured. They explored unfamiliar territories, adapted to changing environments, and laid the foundations for thousands of years of human history across the Americas. Yet the world around them was beginning to change. The Ice Age was slowly coming to an end. Temperatures were rising. Glaciers were retreating. Ecosystems were transforming. And many of the incredible creatures that had dominated the continent for thousands of years would soon vanish forever. The age of mammoths, giant sloths, dire wolves, and American lions was approaching its final chapter. A mystery that remains one of the greatest unsolved questions in prehistoric history. For thousands of years, humans shared the Americas with some of the largest and most extraordinary animals ever to walk the earth. Mammoths crossed open grasslands. Giant ground sloths browsed through forests and woodlands. Dire wolves hunted in packs. American lions stalked prey across vast territories. These creatures had survived countless generations. They had endured changing environments, harsh winters, and shifting ecosystems. Yet by the end of the Ice Age, many of them were gone. The disappearance of these giant animals is known as the megafaunal extinction event. It remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in prehistoric history. Exactly why so many species vanished continues to be debated today. One explanation focuses on climate change. As the Ice Age came to an end, global temperatures began to rise. Massive glaciers retreated. Grasslands shifted. Forests expanded into regions that had once been open plains. Water sources changed. Entire ecosystems were transformed. Animals that had adapted to colder conditions suddenly faced a rapidly changing world. Food sources became less predictable. Habitats shrank or disappeared. Some species may simply have been unable to adjust quickly enough. For many scientists, climate change clearly played an important role. But another possibility also entered the debate: human hunting. As people spread across the Americas, they became highly skilled hunters. Working together, they could target large animals for food, clothing, tools, and shelter materials. Some researchers proposed that even relatively small human populations could have placed pressure on vulnerable species. Large animals tend to reproduce slowly. If too many adults were removed from a population, recovery could become difficult. This idea became known as the overkill hypothesis. According to this theory, human hunting contributed significantly to the extinction of many Ice Age animals. Yet neither explanation appears to solve every part of the puzzle. Some species disappeared in areas with little evidence of human hunting. Others survived environmental changes for long periods before finally vanishing. As a result, many researchers now favor combination theories. Rather than a single cause, multiple factors may have worked together. Climate change altered habitats. Human hunting added additional pressure. Disease, environmental stress, and ecosystem disruption may have contributed as well. The result was a gradual collapse of many megafaunal populations. Whatever the exact cause, the consequences were profound. The end of the Ice Age marked the end of an ancient world. The mammoths disappeared. The giant sloths vanished. The great predators faded into extinction. Landscapes that had existed for thousands of years were transformed forever. Yet humans survived. As they always had, they adapted. Communities adjusted to changing environments. They developed new hunting strategies. They focused on different food sources. They built cultures suited to a rapidly changing world. The disappearance of the megafauna was not the end of human history in the Americas. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that would eventually lead to the diverse societies, civilizations, and cultures that followed. And yet, despite everything we have learned, many mysteries remain. Questions about migrations. Questions about timelines. Questions about the earliest people who first stepped into this vast continent. Even today, the story is still unfolding. After decades of discoveries, debates, and scientific breakthroughs, one remarkable fact remains. The story of the first Americans is still unfinished. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient campsites. Researchers have analyzed fossil footprints. Geneticists have sequenced DNA from people who lived thousands of years ago. And yet, some of the most important questions remain unanswered. Exactly when did the first humans arrive in the Americas? The answer depends on which evidence ultimately proves correct. Some discoveries suggest human presence more than 20,000 years ago. Others hint at even earlier possibilities. Future excavations may push the timeline further back still. Or they may refine our current understanding in unexpected ways. Another mystery involves migration routes. Did the earliest people travel through Beringia and move south through an ice-free corridor? Did they follow the Pacific coastline along the rich marine environments of the Kelp Highway? Were multiple routes used by different groups over thousands of years? The answer may not be a single pathway. Human history is rarely that simple. Then there are the unknown populations. Ancient DNA has revealed that humanity's past was far more complicated than once believed. Neanderthals, Denisovans, ghost populations known only through genetic traces. What other groups may have existed? How many human stories have vanished without leaving clear evidence behind? Scientists continue searching for answers. And the future promises exciting new discoveries. One of the most promising frontiers is underwater archaeology. Because sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age, many ancient coastlines now lie beneath the ocean. If some of the first Americans traveled along these lost shores, traces of their camps, tools, and settlements may still rest beneath the waves. Hidden for thousands of years. Waiting to be found. DNA technology is also advancing rapidly. Methods that seemed impossible only a generation ago are now routine. Future genetic research may reveal previously unknown migration events, ancient populations, and relationships between early peoples. Every improvement in technology opens another window into the past. Meanwhile, new excavation sites continue to appear. A footprint, a stone tool, a fragment of bone. Sometimes a single discovery can transform an entire field of study. The history of the first Americans reminds us of something important about science itself. Scientific knowledge is never truly finished. Ideas are tested. Evidence is examined. Old theories are challenged. New discoveries force researchers to reconsider what they thought they knew. This process is not a weakness. It is one of science's greatest strengths. Every generation inherits questions from the one before it. And every generation uncovers new clues. Which brings us back to the question that inspired this journey. Were the first Americans a completely different species? Based on everything we know today, the answer is probably no. The evidence strongly suggests they were Homo sapiens, members of our own species. People who laughed, struggled, explored, and survived in a challenging world. But the story is still astonishing. They may have arrived far earlier than once believed. They may have traveled routes that are now lost beneath the ocean. They may have carried genetic histories more diverse and complex than anyone imagined a century ago. The first Americans were not necessarily a different species. Yet they may have belonged to a human story far older, richer, and more mysterious than we ever thought possible. And somewhere beneath deserts, forests, caves, glaciers, and oceans, the next discovery is waiting, ready to rewrite history once again. The story begins and ends with footprints. In the quiet desert of white sands, impressions made more than 20,000 years ago still remain preserved in stone. Simple marks in the earth, left by people who could never have known they were stepping into history. They were not different species. They were not strangers to humanity. They were us, early members of a long and continuing journey. Across Ice Age landscapes, through glaciers, coastlines, and vast open plains, humans moved slowly but steadily into new worlds. They followed food, climate, and instinct. They adapted, survived, and eventually spread across continents that had once been empty of human presence. Much of their story is still missing. Some routes are buried beneath oceans. Some populations are known only through fragments of bone or traces of DNA. And many answers may still be waiting underground, unexcavated and unseen. Yet even in uncertainty, one truth remains steady. Human history is not a straight line. It is a long, quiet river of movement, memory, and change. As you think back on this journey, imagine those silent travelers of the Ice Age, walking across frozen valleys, coastal shores, and ancient deserts under skies filled with stars. And then let it fade. Like footprints in sand slowly softened by time. Still there. But gently disappearing into calm.